Hello everyone, thank you for being here in our third lecture of graduation seminars by the Department of Architecture at Kadir Has University. So this semester, the current conditions allowed us to expand the ways of sharing knowledge and enabled us to open these seminars to the public. So these seminars were intended as a critical forum to introduce influential ideas, movements, architects covering the recent debates in architecture and urban theory, such as those on architectural history, neoliberalism, social justice, urban rights, critical special practices, and so on. Today in our third lecture, we have a very special guest and we are greatly honored to have Mr. Peter Eisenman as a keynote speaker. We would also like to express our gratitude to him for his lecture today, and also to Erdem Tüzün, who very kindly connected us with Mr. Peter Eisenman. Mr. Peter Eisenman, of course, doesn't need a special introduction, but before giving the word to him, I would like to introduce him briefly. Mr. Peter Eisenman is an internationally recognized architect and educator whose award-winning large-scale housing and urban design projects, innovative facilities for educational institutions, and series of inventive private houses attest to a career of excellence in design. Before establishing a full-time architectural practice in 1980, Mr. Eisenman worked as an independent architect, educator, and theorist. In 1967, he founded the Institute for Architecture and Urban Studies, an international think tank for architecture in New York, and served as its director until 1982. Currently, the Charles Gladme Professor in Practice at Yale School of Architecture, Mr. Eisenman's academic career also includes teaching at Cambridge, Princeton, Harvard, Ohio State, and Cooper Union Universities. He is one of the most prominent architectural theorists whose ideas and writings are influencing modern discourse in architecture for a very long time. And I am sure everyone is eager to listen to him. We have students here as well as listeners on YouTube. So without any delay, I would like to give the word to Mr. Peter Eisenman.
Okay. Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to come to Istanbul. I have many fond memories of my time in Istanbul, and my only sadness or regret is that the building that we designed in Yenikapı will not get built, at least not in the near future. That's a certain sadness because we worked long and hard with the authorities in Istanbul, and I think it was really one of my important projects. In any case, we move on in life. Today, I want to do a two-part talk. I first want to introduce the theoretical idea of lateness, an idea that's difficult probably to translate, and I will try and distinguish it from other forms of the idea late. It's a term that I worked on with my colleague, Elisa Turbe, a young architect who teaches with me at Yale and was my former student at Yale. After I finish with the brief introduction on the term, I'm going to show a project, a housing project that I worked on with an architect from Milan, Lorenzo degli Esposti, another young architect who was a former student of mine who now practices in Milano. And we secured a commission to do a condominium building in the center of Milano, which has recently been finished 6 or 8 months ago. And I want to use that perhaps as an idea of what lateness might look like in a building. In other words, the theoretical idea, what could it be in a building? So with that, I will start with the theoretical introduction and then show some images and talk about the project in Milano. So to begin on lateness. Over 2 years ago, I wrote in the magazine Flat Out a critical review of Mario Carpo's then new book, The Second Digital Turn. That critique took the form of a singular idea about complexity and resistance in architecture. The point I was making that because the second digital turn could process big data faster than ever before, so fast, in fact, that when what could superficially be seen as complexity would in fact turn out to be nothing more than simplicity. The second digital turn, according to Carpo, was characterized by a visual excess of data. It was thought at that time that the digital could provide a possible direction for architecture in Daniel Kohler's theory of mereology. This was a theory of parts. The part would become free-floating, neither signifier nor signified, as in a major tenet of deconstructive theory, and approximating what Kohler has called a voxel. A project of voxels torn from a part-to-whole context and existing not as things, but as gaps, as absences between things, could suggest an architectural project. However, a problem remained which had to do with the relationship between the processes that produce architecture and the way architecture is read. Now, some 2 years later, there is another idea which could be aimed at the hegemony of the digital. That idea concerns a different conception of time. Most advances in the project of the modern have been located in the time of the avant-garde, the canon of the new and projective, of a more ideal future. The digital being only the latest of these many attempts over the past 100 years. A young architect, Elisa Turbi, and myself published a small book, and it is very small. You can get it on Amazon, and I think it's worth reading. The book is called Lateness, as is the idea we're talking about, which is an indirect attack on the digital. Thus, I want to argue today that lateness represents a potential challenge to the digital avant-garde. Unlike most attempts to speak of the late, such as late modern, late style, etc., lateness carries a unique condition of time which could destabilize the virus of the new. There are two usually understood meanings of the adjective late. The first use of the term, and this also is in the English language, of course, the first use of the term refers to a late style as an individual's work of an old age, and the changes that occur in that style because of this age. For example, Picasso's late style is a good example of these changes. The second context is used to describe lateness in a period style, such as late Baroque or late modern. However, the use of the term that concerns us here is neither of these two meanings. Rather, it is Theodor Adorno's use of the term lateness, as in Beethoven's late work, to distinguish it from the subjectivity of a late personal style. Adorno proposes a redefinition of the term late as an agency of the period, a formal concern as opposed to the idea of self-expression. Lateness in this context becomes a resistance to self-expression. Basically, this means that the relationship between form and time must be rethought. That is no longer one of the avant-garde. The emphasis on the formal as opposed to the citational produces a temporal ambiguity, causing time to become discontinuous. This conception of time differs from the dialectical framework of the 20th century in architecture that relied on a rejection of what came before, an attitude that was prevalent both in the modern era's pronouncements of a break with the past, as well as the subsequent postmodern rejection of that modernist break. century, it seemed that the digital would produce a different temporality, as its emergent forms seemed to have no history at all. However, it has since become evident that the digital is a recapitulation of what could be called a techno-zeitgeist, in which the limits of form are determined by the boundaries of the technology itself. For example, in parametric design, form is determined by numerical inputs. At the same time, the idealization of technological progress clouds the perception of its imposed formal limits. The digital does not transcend the dialectical frame of the 20th century, but rather reverts to the idealization of the present that characterized the modern. Against this background, Lateness presents an alternative view of form in time because the integrity of form is preserved at the scale of specific architectural conventions, while at the same time inherited notions of how one convention might relate to another are challenged or reinvented. So it's not the conventions in architecture that change, but it's their relationships. Lateness is neither an explicit break with history nor an overt return to the past. Lateness has no ties to any particular style, nor does it operate as a style in itself. Rather, it manifests itself as an interruption to linear time, a caesura, if you will, and as such, its form must be contingent, its outward appearance dependent on the historical context in which certain conventions are dominant and others are suppressed. A study of lateness offers the possibility of uncovering a critical mode in which the invention of new form is no longer the stated goal of a critical architecture. Instead, a different critical mode might emerge in questions about the relationship between form and time proposed in the term lateness. What is different today and what I thought 2 years ago is the relationship to time. The parts are no longer situated in the new. Rather, the interruptions in linear time, the caesurae, which create the parts, are no longer in the new, in the time present, but look both forward and backward. When form is contingent, a different critical mode must emerge, or might emerge, not must, in questions about the relationship between form and time. The late comes into being when a convention is temporarily displaced, causing the relationship between parts within an architectural work to be reinvented. The contingency of late form is both temporal and spatial. The spatial, propelled by digital tools and their capacity to generate unprecedented deformations, remains aligned to the conditions of the present through an idealization of technology. In contrast, the decontextualized conventions that I'm talking about that characterize the late destabilize ideological, stylistic, and historical narratives. Basically, therefore, what I'm saying that within the purview of the late, the effects of the digital are irrelevant. That is, irrelevant to anything to do with late style or late in that context. What is relevant is the placing of architectural conventions in a fractured temporal context where their former narratives are suspended, rather meaningless in the contingency of the gaps. That gives you a brief introduction as to the ideas that are contained in the little book. And I think it's an interesting book. But how then does lateness relate to the work? And that's what I want to show today, that we did a project with Lorenzo Degli Esposti in Milano called Piazza Carlo Erba. And we did it in the context, the same context that we were producing the book, we were producing the work. And so we're going to see what I consider to be some effects of the idea of lateness in this project. In other words, it's not an avant-garde project, it's not a reactionary project, it is somewhere in between. So it's possible that we could call this lateness. Can I have, Erdem, the first picture, please? Okay, good. I'm going to see if my thing works today. Okay. So here is the project. It's the gray and white building situated. It has certain zoning restrictions. It is in the northeast of the Duomo. It's probably 1 kilometer or 2 to the east of the Duomo. But you see it takes the condition of being from the context. Next, please. Okay, here is where it is in the map of Milano. The Duomo would be somewhere over here, so you can see how far away it is. The university is up here, so where the architecture school is, so approximately where it is. It's between the university and the cathedral. Next, please. I show you a building done in 1922 by an architect called Giovanni Muzio, who was a fascist architect, but he produced this building that you see, a housing block called Ca Bruta in 1922, the first year of the fascist revolution. And to me, it's one of the most important buildings in Milan because it establishes a modern idea of turning the corner not as a hard edge, but as a rounded edge. But more importantly, it establishes in a material way the three-part Milanese palazzo, the historical palazzo, of a base of piano nobile and an attic story as a residential housing block in the material. So here we have a base which is light. We have a dark, as it were, mid or piano nobile, and above we have a light attic story. And so this is a modern incarnation of the old typology, done in material and with a modern idea of the corner being rounded. To me, this was the energy that propelled our project. In other words, this would be considered in its time a late project. That is, in 1922 in Italy, to do something like this, it couldn't have been considered avant-garde. It would be considered backward in a certain way. But to use it today has a certain resonance with the term lateness. Next, please. And here we can see it in the context. It's really interesting. It is a perimeter block building. This is the part that Muzio did. And then he did across the street this rectilinear block. And so we get a really interesting play between the rounded corner and the square corner, between a perimeter block and a linear block like the Uffizi in Florence. So two typologies on the facade, two typologies on the interior, and there is a really interesting play between these typologies and what I would call lateness today. Next, please. So we started with a perimeter block. This was the actual block that we had. We had a certain limitation in terms of height, and we had a certain limitation at the corner. We had to keep a building was historically marked. This was the desired density that we had. The trouble is that we couldn't build this density because of certain zoning restrictions. So you will see how much we lost from this perimeter block, which I think is really interesting to see how our project takes its shape from the existing zoning. Next, please. So what happens is that we had to have a setback over here, so we lost some space here. We had to have, as you see, the arrow pushes in. We couldn't be that close to the street, so we lost some material. And there was also the need to keep this distance here. So all of these things began to eat away and erode at the perimeter block. Next, please. And we see again the corner. First of all, we lost this amount to make sure that we had the distance between our blocks in the interior. And then we lost the corner because we couldn't build out to that corner. So this is what so far we had left from the original perimeter block. Next. It was a very simple idea then to connect them into one block with hard edges, and then to take up the context of the Muzio, we softened those edges. Next, please. And there is the ultimate form of the building that we ended up with, which has a continuous curve situation. What's important to understand is in terms of the environmental impact and in terms of global warming, we wanted a building with no corridors. And in order to do that, we wanted to have cross ventilation so that each apartment had at two exposures, number one, and that there were no apartments that weren't accessed through an elevator. So we had elevator cores, 6 of them on the building, that can do the next, please. We shifted slightly so there would be a front and the back of the building, which is a tradition in Italy. The front is different than the back. Next. And here are the elevator cores. So with these elevator cores, every apartment faced onto an elevator core, and every apartment had a cross ventilation so that there was really no need for air conditioning in the summer. And this is what it looked like, so that we had an elevator core servicing each of these 2 apartments. So there was never more than 2 and 3 if there was a studio apartment. So here is the formal rhythm that accrues, and here's the functional rhythm that accrues to the project. Next, please. And here is the building in its being, and you have to notice that there is a park here, which we were very conscious of trying to preserve a certain continuity with that park. And so you get this form, this projection into the project of this park area. So in terms of the context, the form relates very specifically to the open space that we found in the context. Next, please. And you see each apartment has a private balcony. In other words, so again, the open air is part of what's important. We have always on one side living, and on the other side we have bedrooms. And then that shifts, next please, where we can have on the outboard side balconies and the bedrooms on the inboard side. So it shifts depending on the location of the form, the building mass on the site. Next, please. And you can see the section, what was very important to us was the idea of this projection so that the top is pressed in and the bottom is pressed out. And so you get a different in the facade relationship, the solid and void relationships, that the front in Italian architecture is also usually flat and the back is usually articulated. So we have rough and smooth or flat and articulated as part of the Italian typology. Next, please. And here you can see in drawing, here is the palazzo that we had to keep. Here it is, and it's the base is a travertine, Roman travertine base, which we also used in terms of material and color. There's the piano nobile, which is here in this building, and it's here in our building. And then we have the attic story here. And then above that, there are these 2 and 3 floor villas, which we call urban villas, which give you a sense of living in a townhouse on top of a palazzo. So the idea of the building is really important, and the material and the openings all relate to what Muzio was doing in 1922. But what is different, why we are talking about lateness as what we call a hybrid between the old and the new, is that while we have the typology of a palazzo, an Italian palazzo, we have in the white frame elements the modern idea. So you have on the upper level the framing of the elements, the material stone elements in steel and glass, and they are articulated. So the building is, say, classical down below and modern up above, which creates this hybrid, which is the hallmark, we are saying, of what Muzio was doing in 22 and what a late project would be like. That is the notion of hybridity, which is important addition to how you can deploy lateness into the present by creating a hybrid structure. Next, please. And here you can see what it looks like. Here is the rounded corner on the street, and you can see the steel frame, which is example of the modern, which takes you all the way down to this level here. And then you have the stone and piano nobile down below. So the hybrid is clear, it's expressed, and it becomes an important aesthetic device for being called late, because a hybrid work cannot be either avant-garde or classical. It's part of both. So we have both parts that meld together in the project. Next, please. And here you can see the idea of the back of the building. The grid, which comes forward on the front, is set in. You see it revealed here and set into the stonework in the back. So again, subtle things make this building impossible to read as a single entity. It is a hybrid of separate parts, part of a typology, part of an aesthetic, part of a functioning building, part of an environmental concern, etc. So all of these things, to me, intersect in the design and construction of this building. Next, please. And you can see here how the existing building that we had to keep as a whole, and how we placed our building on top of it. So you see the ending is just a void frame. You have the classical base, and you have a modern material grid up above, and you get the three parts: the frame, the modern, and the base. Next, please. There's a view from the front. You can see the existing building here, the base, the piano nobile here, and the attic story here. And it's all within the way the openings are made. So they are different scale on the base, as they are in the piano nobile, as they are in the attic story. And so there are quite a number of subtle deviations from an entirely homogeneous work. That's why we can call it late, and we can call it late because of the hybrid nature of what Muzio was doing in 1922 and what we're doing in 2019. And here's the garden from across the street that you can see moves right into our garden piece. And you can see why the indentation in the building responding to the thrust of the garden. Next, please. And here is the other side from the necessary classical building. Notice the missing vertical element. This is, people ask me about it all the time. It's missing because in terms of the zoning, we were so tight in terms of the flight path to the inner city airport, Linate, that there was no way that we could have kept this column. And so we had to move the column, and therefore the building looks incomplete, but it's incomplete because the zoning restriction. That's how tight we were to the necessary requirements of light and air into the building and to the flight path. Next, please. And here you can see from the balcony, these balconies can then be subdivided into private terraces, and each flat, whether it's 1, 2, or 3 stories, has a private balcony and cross ventilation. So those are two of the aspects that we are very proud of in terms of the requirements of this project. Next, you can see now, again, looking across from one of the balconies, get a good view not only of our project, but of Milan. There are no buildings really any taller, or not very many, that are taller than this project. So get a good view to the cathedral. Next, please. And here you can see the lighting at night emphasizes the tripartite Evel, the Roman travertine here, the piano nobile, highly lit, and the attic story, which is in white marble. So I need to mention that. That's white marble. This is steel and glass, the piano nobile, and this is Roman travertine. So that the coloration of the, not only the size and shape of the elements, but the texture of the elements is this bipartite condition. Next, please. And here is our garden at night, again with a special lighting that gives you the three-part dimension. Next, the interior space, there's quite a bit of flowing space on the interior. Most of the interiors have this expansive view out, a storage wall in the center, which doesn't go all the way up to the ceiling, and then the private accommodations on the right. This is a characteristic of each of the apartments. Next, please. And to now, here is the right-hand side. You can see the storage wall, which is similar, the balcony, and Milan beyond. Next. And you see conceptually, you have the grid on the pavement, which you can see, and of course in here, the storage wall, which doesn't go all the way up, as you can see the columns go by it, and then the bedroom wing, as it were, behind. So there's this tripartite relationship between a space out front, an intermediate space that gives a certain sound privacy, and then the private accommodations in the rear. And the kitchen element is tucked in the front of the space. Next, please. And here, what we were lucky about recently, maybe 5 or 6 months ago, we got to take some drone images, and what that tells you is how important the roof and the looking down on the building is, because there's so many possible photographs from the drone. Here you can see the scale of Milan, very few interruptions to the skyline, and clearly the upper stories have great views out over Milan. Next, please. And again, view from a small drone. Next. Here is the roofscape, and conceptually you can see very clearly how it operates with the ground and within its own internal organization. Next. Next. I think that's it. One more or two more. Next. That it? Heard them? Okay. I think it's too much to say that hybridity and lateness are equally manifest in this building. It's something that we were working on, developing the book, Lateness, and the idea of hybridity, or what has been called a third space. And at the same time, we were operating on this building. There's several other projects that we have designed in the interim, which take into account this idea much more fully, let's say, than this building does. This was developed along with the book Lateness at the same time. We have nothing yet under construction because of COVID, but we're working on a large project in Tbilisi, Georgia, which we finished the schematic approval from the government, which has basically shut down Georgia to begin the housing project. It's 2,000 housing units, so it's a really large scale for us project and will be important for the future of, we'd like to think, housing in a COVID world and environmentally challenged world. So with that, I want to thank you all, and I'm looking forward to some questions if you have any. I hope that you'll translate them because my hearing is not that good and the pronunciation will cause me some problems. So if you can send me the questions.
For your presentation, maybe while we are waiting for questions, I can ask one. Now, based on your book and especially in this presentation, I think we can define lateness as a consciousness that consists of architectural designs that are not interested in novelty or trying to fit within the zeitgeist of the contemporary architecture. So zeitgeist as a term kind of has a negative vibe in this perspective. We can see that it's used as an excuse on some occasions or to cover up the conflict between such ideas of autonomy of architecture, idealizing tendencies, or existing paradigm versus the local, individual, and unique realities. So by looking from this perspective, can we adopt lateness as a tool or as a way of communication to negotiate between these conflicts, such as the idealism tendencies of the high modernism or, digital tools to avoid the totalizing effects of a paradigm?
Well, first of all, the modern, in my opinion, was an idealization of technology in terms of the physical form and an idealization of time in the concept of the zeitgeist. This, to me, is why modernism as a totalizing idea failed. So what we're saying is that what lateness is about is against the idealization, against the Hegelian dialectic that says being, anti-being, and or thing, anti-thing, and another thing, and not as a synthesis. We're seeing lateness as a non-dialectical, non-synthetic condition. I think it's important to understand that the charge is directed ideologically against the idealization of the zeitgeist in terms of time and in terms of technology, in terms of materiality. So it is a counter proposition to those two. And I don't think it has the totalizing characteristics because of the nature of hybrid. The minute you put in hybrid, it is no longer a totalizing condition. So that would be my response to that question.
Okay, let's see. So, okay, so another question is asking, like, so it starts with this comment, and so the architecture fundamentally changed in response to new cultural paradigms, especially in the last 2 decades. We are kind of seeing opposing ideas. One consists of a formalism devoid of a social ideology, or tending towards this form researches, like eccentric forms. Especially with the help of the digital tools, the main focus seems like resisting an homogeneous form, but seeking another kind of aesthetics, like seeking for heterogeneity. So yet the social goals are still missing, or they are kind of market driven at the moment. And on the other hand, we see these small critical special practices focusing on small scale interventions, community participation and such, and possibly leaving the form in the background. So do you think that such oppositions exist in the contemporary architecture? And if so, do you think the threshold between modern and postmodern increase the gap between these oppositions?
First of all, I spoke of a housing project that we're working on at present of 2,000 units. So the scale can be 2,000, it can be 200, it can be 50. Social housing is needed in all over the world. The question is, can you provide social housing that is get a share of the market that is not too expensive, and that involves environmental considerations. So I don't think this is an either-or situation. I think that what I'm talking about is the possibility of making a hybrid project that is neither quote-unquote avant-garde, that is not classical, but is somewhere in between, so that you don't have to have any of these idealizing tendencies. What I showed is in its hybrid nature, no longer ideal. And if we take the ideality away from modern and postmodern, I think that this will have been quite an interesting feat if we can do that. And that's the intent of the idea of lateness. The denial of the idealization of technology, i.e. the digital, or steel and glass, as was the case in the modern. We're against the idealization of any of these so-called tools.
Okay, yes, we have a question from our students. Did you have any concerns about designing a facade striking from the surroundings? If so, what were they?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear. Do I have any concerns designing what?
A facade striking from the surroundings.
Yeah, but I would like to think, number one, that in terms of the physical context, we fit into the context in terms of the height of the building, in terms of the scale of the openings, the scale of the apartments, the scale of the open space, but we're not the context, so that we fit in but don't fit in. In other words, the materials are different. We didn't want it to look old, nor did we want it to look new, but we wanted it to be within the old and the new as something other, I would say. And it was other that our idea was, not different, but other, which took characteristics of the old and the new at the same time. And I think you can see the influence of Tarani's building, the Casa Rustici in Milan, some of his other apartment buildings. You can see, and he was certainly an avant-garde designer. And then you can see the influence of Muzio, who was not, it was a classical designer. You can see the play between the fascist concerns and, let's say, the liberal left concerns. So I would like to think that it's both and rather than neither nor. It's both classical, it's both modern, but neither as a dominant characteristic.
So we have one more from YouTube. First, from Sabri Gökmen. He's thanking you for a great presentation. And he has a question about the intersection of technology and aesthetics. I'm just, saying his exact words. On the first digital turn, Mario Carpo mentions your early digital work in the 90s, where you look ways to describe the aesthetic effects, informal composition, and spatial perception of form. My question is, with the increase of technological tools at our hands, how much our approach to form making has changed during the post-digital era?
Well, I think that our approach to form making has changed radically. Why? Because number one, student architects, let's just talk about the people that we teach. They no longer draw. Their main idea of representation is computer platforms like Rhino or 3D Studio or those kinds of things. My students don't start with precedent in history. Like when we were doing Yayınlanacaktır, we used a grid from Hagia Sophia that was very little understood. But if you look at the project of Yayınlanacaktır, you will see the gridiron typology of Hagia Sophia. So that comes out of the Middle East. The situation, as far as I'm concerned, is that Rhino has no knowledge of what was going on in Hagia Sophia. So that my students start with these abstract shapes. They spin around. It drives me crazy. And they devolve everything from either a cube or a globe or a triangle or a pyramid from some form, and they attack that form, and that's how they design. There's no precedent at all. They don't understand precedent. And to me, one of the important contextual things of architecture has always been the precedent. That is what we learned from architects like Palladio, from Schinkel, from Le Corbusier, from the great Turkish architects of the past. They are the important conditions of context which have been missing with the new digital platforms. And I think we have to get back to the idea of what I consider to be precedent. That's why I present the project today as a project of precedent rather than a project of digital idealization.
Thank you. We have a new question from students. So Hajar is asking, so can you consider lateness as a kind of performance or act to de-sacralize the ideal illusion of modernism and any other movement, or an invitation to do so?
I can't answer yes. I would like to be able to answer yes, because I don't know enough about lateness and its difference from a temporal present or a design precedent, let's say. So we're evolving with the architecture that we're doing and with the publication. We're working in our studio, for example, on a project of hybridity. And we're working on not dialectical building because the context that we're talking about has courtyard buildings or block buildings. In other words, modernist standalone buildings or contextual courtyard buildings. Those are the two typologies that exist in the context we're working. We're trying to develop a third space, which is neither courtyard nor block building, is a marriage of the two. And that's what we're calling hybrid, and that's what we're calling late. So you can call anything you want late today as a student or as an architect because it's still, as long as it doesn't idealize as a universal notion of being, and as long as it is subordinate, let's say, to contextual concerns, to environmental concerns, it can be any number of things. It won't be a single look, and so I'm hopeful that our students are producing something that we haven't seen before. To me, that would be one aspect of Late, and at the same time, it's something that we would have seen before in a different context, another aspect of Late. So in another year's time, we will have several student projects. We'll have probably a building or two that deals with the Late. I think Yenikapu, if it had been built, would have been possibly that kind of an idea, not as clear as the housing project in Milan. So that would be my answer to the student. Anyway, thank you for the questions. And I hope to be able to come to Istanbul after the COVID again, and maybe one of the days to realize a building that we worked very long and hard on, another kind of building perhaps in Istanbul. But thank you for inviting me.
Thank you, Mr. Peter Eisenman, for your lecture today. We are greatly honored by your presence here, and it was a very valuable contribution to our seminars. Thank you again for your kind acceptation to this lecture. Hope to see you in the near future again for another occasion.
Thank you. Thank you kindly.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.